A child begs not to go home with his uncle, and his teacher decides to follow them. What she discovers will change their lives forever. You'll be surprised by this moving story, but first don't forget to subscribe to the channel for 10 years of good luck. The bell echoed through the halls of Tomorrow's Hope Elementary School, marking the end of another school day. Among the bustle of excited children eager to return home, Miss Sarah Thompson watched her students attentively. Her gaze lingered on Tommy, an 8-year-old boy who, unlike his classmates, showed no joy at the end of the school day. Sarah, a 35-year-old woman with an innate passion for teaching, had noticed worrying changes in Tommy over the past few weeks. The boy, who used to be shy but cheerful, now seemed increasingly withdrawn and neglected. His uniform, once immaculate, now looked wrinkled and sometimes dirty. The dark circles under his eyes betrayed nights of little rest. "Tommy, can you come here for a moment, please?" Sarah called softly. The boy approached with hesitant steps, his eyes fixed on the floor. "How are you, Tommy?" "I've noticed you've been a bit distracted lately," said Sarah, bending down to be at the little one's height. Tommy briefly raised his gaze, his brown eyes filled with a sadness that shouldn't exist in a child his age. "I'm fine, Miss Thompson," he mumbled, but his trembling voice said otherwise. Sarah felt her heart shrink. Something wasn't right, and she was determined to find out what it was. "You know you can count on me for anything, right?" she assured him, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. The boy nodded slightly, but before he could say anything more, a gruff voice resonated from the classroom door. "Tommy. Let's go now." Sarah stood up to see a disheveled-looking man at the entrance. She recognized Tommy's uncle, who had been introduced as the boy's guardian at the beginning of the school year. The man, whose name she remembered was Robert, had a hard and impatient expression. "Good afternoon, Mr. Walker," Sarah greeted, trying to maintain a friendly tone. "I was talking with Tommy about his performance in class. Would you have a moment to chat?" Robert frowned, looking nervously toward the hallway. "Not now, teacher. We're in a hurry." "Come on, Tommy," he responded curtly. Tommy visibly tensed at his uncle's words. With an almost imperceptible movement, he moved closer to Sarah, as if seeking protection. It was then that the teacher noticed something that froze her blood, a bruise barely visible on the boy's neck, partially hidden by his shirt collar. "Tommy, are you sure everything is okay?" Sarah insisted, her voice heavy with concern. For an instant, Tommy's eyes filled with unshed tears. He opened his mouth as if wanting to say something, but Robert's voice interrupted him again. "Tommy. Now," shouted the man, his tone becoming threatening. The boy flinched and, with one last pleading look at his teacher, ran to his uncle. Robert grabbed his arm with more force than necessary and dragged him out of the classroom. Sarah remained paralyzed for a moment, her mind processing what she had just witnessed. Something was terribly wrong in Tommy's life, and she couldn't ignore it. With determination, she grabbed her purse and quickly left the classroom. In the school parking lot, she saw Robert putting Tommy into an old pickup truck. The boy seemed resigned, his small body hunched as if carrying an invisible weight. Without thinking twice, Sarah headed to her own car, determined to follow them. While driving, maintaining a prudent distance, Sarah called her husband, Alex. "Honey, I'm going to be late getting home." "There's something I have to do," she said hurriedly. "Is everything okay, Sarah?" asked Alex, worried about his wife's tone. "I'm not sure," she replied, her eyes fixed on Robert's truck. "I'll tell you when I get home. Please, make dinner. I love you." She hung up before Alex could ask more questions. Her heart was pounding as she followed the truck through the city streets, moving farther away from the center toward the poorer suburbs. After almost an hour of driving, Robert finally stopped in front of a dilapidated house on the outskirts of the city. Sarah parked at a safe distance, watching as the man and boy entered the dwelling. The house looked abandoned, with boarded-up windows and an unkempt yard. Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine. How could Tommy live in a place like this? As she contemplated what to do next, she saw movement in one of the windows. It was Tommy, his small face barely visible through a crack in the boards. For an instant, their eyes met, and Sarah saw a mixture of surprise and hope in the boy's eyes. At that moment, Sarah made a decision. She couldn't leave without knowing Tommy was safe. With her heart in her throat, she got out of her car and approached the house. Each step she took was laden with determination and fear. When she reached the door, she hesitated for a moment. What would she say? How would she explain her presence? Before she could knock, the door swung open suddenly, revealing Robert, whose face shifted from surprise to anger in a matter of seconds. "What are you doing here?" he growled, blocking the entrance with his body. Sarah took a deep breath, gathering all her courage. "Mr. Walker, I'm worried about Tommy. I need to know if he's okay." Robert narrowed his eyes, his posture becoming more threatening. "That's none of your business. Leave right now, or I'll call the police." But Sarah didn't move. In her mind, the image of Tommy, scared and vulnerable, gave her the strength to stand firm. "I'm not leaving until I see that Tommy is safe," she declared, her voice trembling slightly but not losing determination. For a tense moment, Robert and Sarah stared at each other, neither willing to back down. The air seemed charged with electricity, and Sarah could hear her own heart pounding furiously in her ears. Suddenly, a small, trembling voice broke the silence. "Uncle Robert, please. Let her in." Tommy had appeared behind his uncle, his pleading eyes alternating between the man and his teacher. Robert seemed to deflate at the boy's words, his rigid posture yielding slightly. With a sigh of defeat, Robert stepped back. "5 minutes," he growled, allowing Sarah to enter. The teacher crossed the threshold, stepping into a world she never would have imagined. The interior of the house was as desolate as the exterior, with sparse and deteriorated furniture. The air smelled of dampness and abandonment. Tommy ran to Sarah, hugging her tightly. She could feel the slight trembling in the boy's body and wrapped him in her arms, offering the comfort he clearly needed. "Tommy, sweetie, are you all right?" she asked softly, examining the boy for signs of abuse. Before Tommy could answer, Robert intervened. "It's not what you think, teacher," he said, his voice tired and defeated. "There's a lot you don't know." Sarah looked at the man, noticing for the first time the deep circles under his eyes and the worry etched on his face. "Then explain it to me," she responded, not letting go of Tommy. "Because what I see tells me this child needs help." Robert collapsed into a rickety chair, running a hand over his face. "It's a long story," he mumbled. "I have time," Sarah replied firmly, sitting on the floor next to Tommy, who clung to her like a lifeline. And so, in that deteriorating house on the outskirts of the city, Robert began to unravel a story that Sarah could never have imagined. A story of love, loss, and a desperate attempt to protect an innocent child from a world that seemed to be against him. As she listened, Sarah knew that her life, and Tommy's, were about to change forever. Night had fallen over the dilapidated house, plunging the living room into darkness broken only by the dim light of a table lamp. Sarah, still sitting on the floor with Tommy curled up beside her, stared intently at Robert, waiting for him to begin his story. The man, slumped in the old chair, seemed to struggle to find the right words. "It all started 2 years ago," Robert finally spoke, his voice hoarse with contained emotion. "My sister, Laura, Tommy's mother, she left us." Sarah noticed how he avoided using the word death, and gently squeezed Tommy's shoulder in a comforting gesture. "Laura was a wonderful woman, but she made the mistake of falling in love with the wrong man," Robert continued, his gaze lost in painful memories. "Tommy's father, James Sullivan, seemed like a good man at first. Charming, successful. But it was all a facade." Tommy tensed at the mention of his father's name, and Sarah hugged him tighter. "James turned out to be a violent and dangerous man," Robert lowered his voice, as if afraid someone else might hear. "Laura suffered in silence for years, until she couldn't take it anymore." Sarah closed her eyes, imagining the horror that poor woman must have lived through. "And Tommy?" she asked softly. Robert looked at the boy with a mixture of love and pain. Tommy was the only ray of light in Laura's life. She endured everything for him, to protect him. But when she realized James was hurting Tommy too. The boy shuddered, burying his face in Sarah's side. "Laura planned to escape," Robert continued. "She called me one night, desperate, asking for help. When I got to their house. His voice broke, unable to continue. Sarah felt her heart constrict, understanding the magnitude of the tragedy this family had faced. I found Laura. She was already gone, Robert managed to say, his eyes bright with unshed tears. Tommy was hidden in a closet, terrified. I didn't waste any time. I took him and we fled that same night. And the father? Asked Sarah, dreading the answer. James has powerful connections, Robert explained, his voice tinged with bitterness. The police did nothing. He claimed I had kidnapped Tommy and that Laura had left of her own free will. We became fugitives overnight. Sarah looked around, now understanding the state of the house and Robert's cautious attitude. You've been running all this time, she murmured. Robert nodded. We've moved from city to city constantly. This is the first time we've stayed in one place this long. I thought we'd be safe here. Tommy, who had remained silent, finally spoke. Uncle Robert does the best he can, he said in a trembling voice. But I'm scared that Dad will find us. Sarah felt her heart breaking at the fear in the boy's voice. Tommy, sweetheart, why didn't you tell me anything? The boy lowered his gaze. Uncle Robert said we couldn't trust anyone. That if someone found out, they'd come for us. Robert leaned forward, his face a mask of guilt and worry. I'm sorry, Tommy. I know I've been hard on you. I just wanted to keep you safe. Sarah processed all this information, her mind working at full speed. As a teacher, she knew she had an obligation to report any suspicion of child abuse. But this situation was much more complex than she had imagined. Mr. Walker. Robert, she said finally. I understand why you've been running, but this is no way to live. Especially for Tommy. You need help. Robert shook his head vehemently. You don't understand. James will find us if we stay in one place. He has resources, connections. But you have resources too, Sarah interrupted with determination. My husband, Alex, is a lawyer. He can help us legalize your situation, get official custody of Tommy. Hope briefly flickered in Robert's eyes, only to be quickly replaced by fear. It's too dangerous. We can't risk it. Sarah stood up, still holding Tommy. Robert, look around you. Look at Tommy. Is this the life Laura would have wanted for her son? Living in fear, without friends, without a stable home. Sarah's words seemed to touch something deep in Robert. His shoulders slumped, and for the first time, Sarah saw the vulnerable man behind the tough facade. I don't know what else to do, Robert admitted, his voice barely a whisper. Sarah approached him, placing a hand on his shoulder. Let us help you. For Tommy, for Laura, for yourself. You don't have to face this alone. Tommy, who had been listening intently, spoke with a voice full of hope. Uncle Robert, please. I want to go to school without being afraid. I want to have friends. I want a real home. The boy's words seemed to be the catalyst Robert needed. With tears in his eyes, he slowly nodded. Okay, he finally said. Okay, let's get help. Sarah felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she was determined to help this broken family find the peace and security they deserved. Good, she said with an encouraging smile. This is the first step. Now, let's go to my house. Alex is waiting for us, and I think we could all use a good dinner and a night's rest. While helping Robert and Tommy gather their few belongings, Sarah couldn't help but think about how much their lives were about to change. Fear and uncertainty were still present, but for the first time in a long time, there was a ray of hope on the horizon. They left the dilapidated house into the night, leaving behind a dark chapter of their lives and moving toward an uncertain future, but one full of possibilities. As she drove back to the city, with Robert and Tommy in the back seat, Sarah promised herself she would do everything possible to help this family find the justice and peace they so deserved. The sun was barely peeking over the horizon when Sarah opened her eyes. For a moment, she felt disoriented finding herself on her living room couch, but quickly the events of the previous night flooded her mind. She sat up softly, trying not to wake Alex, who was sleeping in the adjacent armchair. The house was quiet, a marked contrast to the emotional storm they had lived through just hours ago. Sarah got up and tiptoed to the guest room where Robert and Tommy were sleeping. She cracked open the door carefully and smiled at seeing uncle and nephew deeply asleep, their faces finally relaxed after so much constant tension. Closing the door, Sarah headed to the kitchen. While preparing coffee, her mind went over the conversation they'd had the night before with Alex. Her husband, a respected lawyer in the community, had listened attentively to Robert and Tommy's story, his expression shifting from surprise to determination. "This won't be easy," Alex had said, thoughtfully rubbing his chin. "But there are options. We can file for legal custody for Robert, make a formal complaint against James Sullivan, and seek protection for Tommy." The sound of footsteps interrupted Sarah's thoughts. Alex entered the kitchen, his hair disheveled and eyes still sleepy. "Good morning, honey," Sarah greeted, offering him a cup of coffee. Alex accepted it with a tired smile. "How are our guests?" "Still sleeping," Sarah replied. "I think it's the first night in a long time they've been able to rest without fear." Alex nodded, his expression turning serious. "Sarah, what we're going to do? It won't be easy. We'll be challenging a powerful and dangerous man." Sarah took her husband's hand. "I know, but we can't turn our backs on them. That boy needs help, Alex. And Robert does too." "I agree," said Alex, gently squeezing his wife's hand. "I just want you to be prepared. Our lives are going to change." Before Sarah could respond, they heard movement coming from the guest room. Moments later, Tommy appeared in the kitchen doorway, his large, curious eyes scanning the unfamiliar space. "Good morning, Tommy," Sarah greeted with a warm smile. "Are you hungry? I was about to make breakfast." The boy nodded shyly, approaching cautiously. Alex knelt down to be at his level. "Hi, Tommy. I'm Alex, Sarah's husband. It's nice to meet you." Tommy looked at Alex with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. "Are you going to help us?" he asked quietly. Alex nodded solemnly. "I'll do everything in my power to help you and your uncle. You have my word." A small smile appeared on Tommy's face, the first Sarah had seen since she met him. At that moment, Robert entered the kitchen, his posture tense and watchful. "Good morning," he greeted, his eyes quickly scanning the room as if assessing potential threats. "Robert, please, sit down," said Sarah, gesturing to a chair. "Let's have breakfast and then we can talk about the next steps." While Sarah prepared scrambled eggs and toast, Alex began to explain the plan he had been formulating during the night. "The first thing we need to do," he said, "is establish a legal residence for you. You can't keep living in that abandoned house. I have a friend who owns several apartments, we can arrange for him to rent one to you at an affordable price." Robert seemed about to protest, but Alex raised a hand to stop him. "I know you're worried about money, but that's something we'll figure out. What's important now is your safety and well-being." Sarah placed plates full of food in front of everyone. "Robert," she said softly, "you need a stable job. Not just for the money, but to establish a normal routine for Tommy." The man looked down at his plate. "I've been jumping from job to job to avoid leaving a trail," he admitted. "I understand," said Alex. "But now we need to change that strategy. We need to show that you can provide a stable home for Tommy." Tommy, who had been listening attentively while eating, spoke up. "Does that mean I can keep going to Miss Thompson's school?" Sarah smiled. "That's right, sweetie. And you'll be able to make friends without worrying about suddenly moving away." The boy's eyes lit up with a mixture of excitement and hope. "As for the legal situation," Alex continued, "I'll start preparing the documents to request official custody for Robert. We'll also file a formal complaint against James Sullivan." At the mention of his father's name, Tommy visibly shrank. Robert put a protective hand on the boy's shoulder. "What if he finds us?" asked Robert, fear evident in his voice. "We'll request a protection order," Alex responded firmly. "And we'll work with local law enforcement to ensure your safety. You're not alone in this, Robert." Sarah watched as her husband's words seemed to have a calming effect on Robert and Tommy. For the first time since she met them, she saw a glimmer of real hope in their eyes. "There's a lot of work to do," said Sarah, but we'll do it together, step by step. While they finished breakfast, Sarah couldn't help but feel a mixture of determination and apprehension. She knew the road ahead would be difficult and possibly dangerous, but looking at Tommy, who now smiled shyly while talking with Alex about school, she knew it was worth it. The day was just beginning, and with it, a new chapter in the lives of everyone present. Sarah promised herself she would do everything possible to ensure this new dawn would bring the peace and security that Tommy and Robert so deserved. As she collected the plates, Sarah looked out the window. The sun was already shining brightly, dissipating the last shadows of the night. Somehow, she felt it was a sign of the better days to come, despite the challenges they would face. With renewed energy, Sarah prepared to face the day, knowing that each small step they took would bring them closer to the justice and life that Tommy and Robert deserved. The road would be long, but they wouldn't walk it alone anymore. The weeks that followed passed in a whirlwind of activity. Alex, true to his word, had secured a small apartment for Robert and Tommy in a quiet neighborhood of the city. It was modest, but clean and safe, a world apart from the rundown house where they had been living. Sarah watched with a mixture of pride and concern as Tommy slowly began to emerge from his shell at school. The boy, who used to sit alone during recess, now played shyly with some classmates. His academic performance had also improved notably. One afternoon, while Sarah was grading papers at her desk, she noticed Tommy lingering after the bell rang. The boy approached with hesitant steps, clutching the strap of his backpack. "Miss Thompson," he said quietly, "can I talk to you?" Sarah put down her pen and gave him her full attention. "Of course, Tommy. What's wrong?" The boy hesitated for a moment before speaking. "It's about my dad. Do you think he'll come looking for me?" Sarah's heart clenched at the obvious fear in the child's eyes. She stood up and knelt in front of him, gently taking his hands. "Tommy, listen to me carefully," she said with a firm but loving voice. "Alex, your Uncle Robert, me, and many other people are working very hard to keep you safe. We won't let anyone hurt you, understand?" Tommy nodded slowly, but Sarah could see there were still doubts in his gaze. "I know you're scared," she continued, "and it's okay to feel afraid. But remember, you're not alone anymore. You have a family that cares for you, even if we're not all related by blood." A small smile formed on Tommy's face. "You and Mr. Alex are my family too." Sarah felt a lump form in her throat. "Yes, sweetheart. We're your family too." Impulsively, Tommy launched himself into Sarah's arms, hugging her tightly. She held him close, feeling how the boy trembled slightly. "Everything will be all right, Tommy," she murmured, stroking his hair. "I promise you." Meanwhile, at the law firm, Alex faced his own challenges. He had spent hours investigating James Sullivan's case, uncovering a network of connections and influences that made the case even more complex than he had anticipated. One afternoon, while reviewing documents in his office, his assistant, Emily, entered with a worried expression. "Mr. Thompson," she said, "this just arrived by urgent courier." Alex took the envelope she offered and opened it cautiously. As he read its contents, he felt his blood run cold. It was a warning letter, subtly threatening, from a law firm representing James Sullivan. "They're trying to intimidate us," Alex muttered, more to himself than to Emily. "Sir?" she asked, concerned. Alex shook his head, trying to maintain his composure. "It's nothing, Emily. Thank you for bringing this to me." Once alone, Alex leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair in frustration. He knew things would get difficult, but he hadn't expected James Sullivan to react so quickly. It was evident that the man had eyes and ears everywhere. He took his phone and dialed Robert's number. "Robert, it's Alex," he said as soon as the other man answered. "I need you and Tommy to be very careful. It looks like James is starting to make moves." There was a tense silence on the other end of the line before Robert responded with a trembling voice. "What do we do now?" "For now, maintain your normal routine," Alex advised. "But be alert to anything unusual. I'm going to expedite the proceedings for the protection order." After hanging up, Alex stared out his office window, watching the bustle of the city below. He felt like he was in the eye of a storm, knowing that at any moment things could explode. That night, in Robert and Tommy's small apartment, the atmosphere was tense. Robert paced back and forth in the living room, casting nervous glances toward the window every few minutes. Tommy, sitting on the couch with a storybook Sarah had given him, watched his uncle with concern. "Uncle Robert," he finally said, "are you okay?" Robert stopped and looked at his nephew, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Yes, Tommy. I'm just a little worried." The boy closed his book and approached his uncle, taking his hand. "Miss Thompson says we have a family looking out for us now. That everything will be okay." Robert felt a lump form in his throat. He knelt to be at Tommy's height and hugged him tightly. "You're right, little one," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "We have people who care about us. And I'll always protect you, no matter what." While hugging his nephew, Robert made a silent promise. No matter what James Sullivan tried, he wouldn't allow him to hurt Tommy again. He would fight with everything he had to give the boy the safe and happy life he deserved. At that moment, Robert's phone vibrated with a message. It was from Sarah. "Alex and I want you to come over for dinner tomorrow. We have important news to share. Don't worry, we're in this together." Robert read the message to Tommy, and for the first time in days, both smiled genuinely. Despite the fear and uncertainty, they knew they weren't alone anymore. Sarah and Alex's house was filled with a delicious aroma when Robert and Tommy arrived for dinner. Sarah welcomed them with a warm hug, while Alex set the table in the dining room. Come in," said Sarah, guiding them inside. "Dinner's almost ready." Tommy, more relaxed than ever in this familiar environment, ran to Alex to show him a drawing he had made at school. "Look, Mr. Thompson," exclaimed the boy enthusiastically. "It's our family." Alex took the drawing, feeling a lump in his throat as he saw the colorful figures representing Tommy, Robert, Sarah, and himself, all holding hands under a bright sun. "It's beautiful, Tommy," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We'll put it on the fridge for everyone to see." Robert observed the scene with a mixture of gratitude and apprehension. He had never imagined they would find people so willing to help them, to consider them family. But the persistent fear of James Sullivan still lurked in the corners of his mind. During dinner, conversation flowed easily, with Tommy animatedly telling them about his new friends at school and the science project he was working on. However, both Robert and Alex could feel the underlying tension, knowing they had important news to share. Finally, when the dessert plates were empty, Alex cleared his throat. "Robert, Tommy," he began, his tone turning serious. "We have some updates about your legal situation." Robert straightened in his chair, instinctively pulling Tommy closer. "We've made progress with the custody petition," Alex continued. "The judge has scheduled a hearing for next week. It's an important step." Sarah took Robert's hand across the table. "This is good, Robert. It means the system is starting to work in your favor." Robert nodded slowly, but his eyes revealed his concern. "And James? Has there been any news from him?" Alex exchanged a look with Sarah before responding. "Yes, there have been developments. James has hired a very powerful law firm. They're contesting our custody petition and they've filed charges against you, Robert, for alleged kidnapping. Continuing due to length." The silence that followed was deafening. Tommy, who had been playing with the crumbs of his dessert, looked up, his eyes filled with fear. "Are they going to take my uncle away?" he asked in a trembling voice. "No, sweetheart," Sarah quickly responded, moving around the table to hug the boy. "We won't let that happen." Alex leaned forward, his voice firm and determined. "Robert, these charges are baseless, and we'll prove it. We have evidence of James's abuse, testimonies from neighbors and staff from Tommy's previous school. You're not alone in this." Robert, who had remained silent, finally spoke. Maybe we should leave. Keep running. I don't want to cause you any more trouble." "No," Tommy exclaimed, clinging to Sarah. "I don't want to go. We have a family here." Sarah stroked the boy's hair, looking at Robert with determination. "Robert, running isn't the solution. You've been running for too long. It's time to face this, to fight for the future Tommy deserves." Alex nodded, backing up his wife's words. Besides, I have other news. I've contacted an investigative journalist, Catherine Reed. She's interested in exposing the corruption that has allowed men like James Sullivan to abuse the system for so long. A journalist? Robert asked, skeptical. Isn't that dangerous? Catherine is known for her integrity and courage, Alex explained. She's worked on similar cases before. She believes your story, Tommy's story, could be the catalyst for real change in how these abuse and custody cases are handled. Tommy, who had been listening attentively, spoke with surprising maturity for his age. If we tell our story, could we help other kids like me? Sarah felt her eyes fill with tears at the child's compassion. Yes, Tommy. You could help many children. Robert looked at his nephew, seeing in his eyes a mixture of fear and determination. At that moment, he made a decision. Okay, he said finally. No more running. We'll face this together. Alex smiled, feeling a flash of hope. Excellent. Tomorrow we'll meet with Catherine. It will be the first step in bringing this whole situation to light. The morning arrived with a mixture of anticipation and nervousness. Sarah prepared breakfast in the kitchen, while Alex reviewed his notes for the meeting with Catherine Reed, the investigative journalist. Robert, who had slept little, helped Tommy get ready for school. Do I have to go today, Uncle? Asked Tommy, his large eyes worried. I want to be with you when you talk to the journalist lady. Robert knelt in front of his nephew, adjusting the collar of his school uniform. Tommy, it's important that you keep your normal routine. Besides, school is the safest place for you right now. The boy nodded, though without much enthusiasm. Robert continued, his voice soft but firm. I promise to tell you everything when you get back, okay? Okay, Tommy responded, hugging his uncle. In the kitchen, Sarah was pouring coffee when the doorbell rang. Alex went to answer, returning moments later with a woman of determined appearance and penetrating eyes. Good morning, everyone, Catherine Reed greeted, her voice warm but professional. Thank you for receiving me so early. After introductions, everyone sat around the kitchen table. Tommy, curious, observed the newcomer while nibbling on his toast. Tommy, Sarah said gently, it's time for school. Robert will take you today, all right? The boy nodded, picking up his backpack. Before leaving, he stopped next to Catherine. Are you going to help us tell our story? He asked with a mixture of shyness and hope. Catherine smiled, moved by the little one's frankness. That's my job, Tommy. I'll do everything I can to make your voice heard. Once Robert and Tommy left, the atmosphere in the kitchen turned more serious. Catherine pulled out a recorder and a notepad. Before we begin, she said, looking at Alex and Sarah, I need you to understand the risks. This story could shake many power structures. James Sullivan isn't a man who gives up easily. Alex nodded gravely. We're aware of the dangers, but we believe it's necessary. Too many children and families have suffered in silence. Catherine began asking questions, taking detailed notes about Tommy and Robert's story, James's abuse, and how the system had failed to protect them. Sarah shared her observations as a teacher, describing the changes she had noticed in Tommy. There's something else you should know, said Catherine after a pause. I've been investigating James Sullivan on my own. His network of influence is more extensive than we imagined. He has connections in the police force, the judicial system, even local government. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. What does that mean for us? For Tommy? Catherine looked at her with determination. It means we need to be extremely careful. But it also means this story could be the thread that unravels an entire network of corruption. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, Robert walked with Tommy toward school, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings for any sign of danger. Uncle, Tommy said suddenly, do you think Mom would be proud of us? Robert stopped, surprised by the question. He knelt down to look Tommy in the eyes. Your mother would always be proud of you, Tommy. You're brave and strong, just like she was. The boy smiled, but his eyes filled with tears. I miss her so much. I miss her too, Robert responded, hugging his nephew. But we're honoring her memory by fighting for a better future. When they reached the school, Sarah was already there, greeting students at the entrance. She gave Tommy a special hug and shared a meaningful look with Robert. "I'll keep an eye on him," she assured him quietly. "Be careful." Robert nodded and, after one last look at Tommy, headed back to Sarah and Alex's house. In James Sullivan's office, the atmosphere was tense. The man pounded his desk in frustration while listening to his private investigator's report. "How is it possible you haven't located them yet?" James growled. "They've been in the same city this whole time and you couldn't find them." The investigator, a nervous middle-aged man, was sweating profusely. "Mr. Sullivan, we've been close. We know the boy is in a local school, but—" "No excuses." James interrupted. "I want my son back, understand? Use whatever resources necessary. Bribe whoever you have to bribe. But find them." When the investigator left, James remained staring out the window of his luxurious office. His face, once handsome, was now marked by lines of bitterness and rage. "I'll find you, Tommy," he muttered to himself. "And I'll make everyone who tried to keep you from me pay." Back at Sarah and Alex's house, the meeting with Catherine Reed was coming to an end. The journalist packed away her notes, her expression serious but determined. "I'll start working on the story immediately," she said. "But you need to be prepared. Once this comes to light, there's no turning back." Alex took Sarah's hand, both sharing a look of resolution. "We're ready," he affirmed. "For Tommy, for Robert, and for all the families who have suffered in silence." Catherine stood to leave, but before going, she turned to them. "One last thing. From now on, be very careful. James Sullivan will stop at nothing to get what he wants. Protect yourselves, and above all, protect Tommy." As the door closed behind Catherine, Sarah and Alex remained in silence, aware that they had crossed a point of no return. The battle ahead would be the hardest of their lives, but they were willing to face it together. Outside, the sun shone in a clear sky, oblivious to the drama unfolding. In the streets, people went about their business, unaware they were about to witness a story that would shake the foundations of their community and beyond. At the school, Tommy sat in Sarah's classroom, trying to focus on his math problems. But his mind kept wandering to the meeting happening at that moment. He imagined his uncle telling their story to the journalist lady, hoping it would help other kids who were scared like he had been. Sarah watched him from her desk, her heart full of both love and worry for this brave little boy who had endured so much. She noticed movement outside the classroom window and saw a car she didn't recognize parked across the street. A man in dark glasses sat behind the wheel, watching the school entrance. Without drawing attention to herself, Sarah quietly called the principal's office. Within minutes, additional staff members were casually positioned near all school entrances, and a police cruiser happened to park nearby. The hours ticked by with excruciating slowness. Sarah maintained a calm exterior for her students' sake, but her nerves were on high alert. When the final bell rang, she made sure Tommy stayed close to her. "We're going to wait for your uncle inside today, okay?" she said gently, trying not to alarm him. Tommy nodded, seeming to understand the unspoken tension. They sat together in the classroom, Sarah helping him with his homework while they waited. Finally, Robert arrived, accompanied by Alex. "Ready to go, buddy?" Alex asked Tommy with a forced cheerfulness that didn't quite mask his concern. As they walked to the parking lot as a group, Sarah noticed the mysterious car was gone. But somehow, its absence felt more threatening than its presence had been. That night, as they all gathered once again in Sarah and Alex's living room, the tension was palpable. Catherine had called earlier, the story was ready. It would break tomorrow at noon, simultaneously across multiple news outlets. "Once this goes public," Alex explained, "things will move very quickly. The police are ready to act on the evidence we've gathered. But the next 24 hours will be crucial." Robert pulled Tommy closer to him on the couch. "What do we do until then?" "You'll both stay here tonight," Sarah said firmly. "We're stronger together." As they prepared for bed, making up the guest room and sofa bed, everyone felt the weight of what was to come. Tomorrow would change everything, for better or worse. None of them slept much that night, each lost in their own thoughts and prayers. Outside, the city slowly grew quiet, unaware that it was about to become the backdrop for a battle between justice and power, between love and control, between good and evil. The storm was about to break, and they could only hope they were strong enough to weather it. Dawn broke over the city with an eerie calm. Sarah was already awake, watching the sunrise from her kitchen window. The coffee maker hummed quietly as Alex joined her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "Did you sleep at all?" he asked softly. She shook her head. Kept checking on Tommy and Robert every hour.
They had converted the living room into a temporary bedroom, with Robert sleeping on the couch and Tommy on a nearby air mattress. Both were still asleep, exhausted from the emotional strain of the past few days. Around 10 a.m., Catherine called. "It's all set," she said, her voice tense but confident. "The story goes live at noon. I've sent copies to every major news outlet in the state. Once it breaks, there's no stopping it." Alex checked his watch. "The police are ready?" "Yes. They're waiting for my signal. The moment the story hits, they'll move on Sullivan and his associates." As the morning wore on, the tension in the house became almost unbearable. Tommy sensed the adult's anxiety and stayed close to Robert, barely touching his breakfast. At 11:30, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from the school principal: "Suspicious vehicles in the area. Stay safe." Alex immediately called his contact at the police department. "They're moving early," he warned. "Sullivan must have gotten wind of something." Just then, they heard car doors slamming outside. Robert rushed to the window, his face turning pale. "He's here." Sarah quickly moved Tommy away from the windows. "The safe room," she said firmly. They had prepared for this possibility, converting Alex's home office into a secure space with a reinforced door. But before they could move, there was a loud bang at the front door. "Open up." James Sullivan's voice boomed. "I know you're in there." Tommy started trembling, and Robert held him close. "It's okay, buddy," he whispered. "We're not running anymore. Remember what we talked about?" The boy nodded bravely, though tears shimmered in his eyes. Alex moved toward the door while Sarah hustled Tommy and Robert toward the office. "Just keep him talking," she whispered to her husband. "The police are coming." "Thompson!" James shouted again. "Open this door or I'll break it down. You have no right to keep my son from me." Alex opened the door but kept the security chain in place. "Mr. Sullivan, you're trespassing. The police are on their way." James's face, visible through the crack, was contorted with rage. "The police work for me, you naive fool. Now, where's my son?" "Your son?" Alex's voice was steady, buying time. "You mean the boy you abused? The one whose mother died trying to protect him from you?" James's face turned purple with fury. "You don't know anything. Laura was weak. She would have ruined the boy, made him soft like her. I'm his father, I know what's best for him. Like you knew what was best when you hit him." Alex challenged. "When you terrorized him so badly he still has nightmares?" With a roar of rage, James slammed against the door. The security chain groaned but held. Alex backed away, hearing sirens in the distance. "You can't hide him forever," James shouted, ramming the door again. This time, the chain began to splinter. In Alex's office, Tommy buried his face in Robert's chest, trying to block out his father's voice. Sarah stood protectively in front of them, her heart pounding but her stance unwavering. The sound of sirens grew louder, and they could hear multiple vehicles screeching to a halt outside. "Police!" "James Sullivan, step away from the door." "No!" James screamed. With one final surge of strength, he crashed through the door. He burst into the house, his expensive suit disheveled, his eyes wild. Two men in dark suits followed him in. Alex backed away, leading James away from the office where the others were hidden. "It's over, Sullivan. The story's already out. Everyone knows what you did." James pulled out his phone, his hands shaking as he saw the breaking news notifications. Catherine's story was everywhere, prominent businessmen exposed, a trail of abuse, corruption, and cover-ups. "You ruined everything," he snarled, advancing on Alex. "I'll destroy you all." Suddenly, the front door burst open again. Police officers flooded in, weapons drawn. James Sullivan. Hands where we can see them. James's hired men immediately surrendered, raising their hands. But James himself made a desperate dash toward the office. He flung open the door, coming face to face with Tommy. For a moment, father and son stared at each other. Tommy, though trembling, stood his ground. Robert and Sarah flanked him protectively. "Tommy," James said, his voice suddenly soft, almost pleading. "Son, come with me. I'm your father." Tommy looked up at him, and for the first time, there was no fear in his eyes, only sadness and determination. "No," he said clearly. "You're not my father anymore. A real father doesn't hurt his family." James lunged forward, but before he could reach Tommy, multiple officers tackled him to the ground. As they handcuffed him, he continued to scream and struggle. "You can't do this to me. Do you know who I am? I'll have all your badges for this." But his threats fell on deaf ears. The police chief himself walked in, holding a copy of Catherine's exposé. "James Sullivan, you're under arrest for child abuse, domestic violence, corruption, and attempted kidnapping. You have the right to remain silent." As they led James away, Tommy watched from the safety of Robert's arms. Sarah and Alex stood close by, forming a protective circle around him. "Is it really over?" Tommy whispered. Sarah knelt beside him, wiping away his tears. "Yes, sweetheart. It's really over. You're safe now." Robert hugged his nephew tighter. "Your mom would be so proud of you, Tommy. You were so brave." Outside, reporters had begun to gather, drawn by the arrest of a prominent businessman. Catherine Reed stood among them, a satisfied smile on her face as she watched justice finally being served. In the days that followed, the story dominated the news. James Sullivan's empire crumbled as more victims came forward. His network of corrupt officials was exposed, leading to multiple arrests and resignations. Robert was granted full custody of Tommy, with no opposition. They moved into a comfortable apartment near Sarah and Alex's house, close enough for Tommy to stay in the same school. Slowly but surely, life began to settle into a new normal. Tommy's nightmares became less frequent, and his smile appeared more often. He made friends at school and started playing Little League baseball. Robert found a steady job and began dating a kind woman who adored Tommy. Sarah watched her former student blossom, knowing that sometimes the greatest acts of courage come from simply refusing to look away when someone needs help. One afternoon, months later, Tommy brought her a drawing. It showed a large group of people, himself, Robert, his new girlfriend, Sarah, Alex, Catherine, and in the sky above them, a smiling figure he said was his mom. "This is my family now," he said proudly. "All of them." Sarah hung the picture in her classroom, a reminder that family isn't always about blood, sometimes it's about the people who stand beside you when the storms come, the ones who help you find your way home.